What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 102, and I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anslone. Solo show today, I'm talking about the things I hate the most, the cops and the wars. So I'm sure I got a great episode for y'all today. If you can support the show, we take financial donations at Patreon and at Subscribestar, or you could donate in crypto. Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash addresses are in the show notes page. Any other crypto you'd like to donate, hit me up. I'll figure out how to take your money. You can support the show for free just by liking or sharing it. Most helpful if you do the video versions of the show. We post that at the libertarianinstitute.org where the show is hosted, or at Odysee or YouTube. And then you can find the show at our social media accounts on Facebook, MeWe, and Twitter. Like and follow those pages. And anywhere people listen to audio podcasts, you could mostly find the podcast up there. So be sure to support the show if you can, and then you could also support the show, support our sponsor and yourself by going to palomaverdestore.com and getting yourself some high quality CBD products. Again, palomaverdestore.com. And this coming Friday, they're actually relaunching their website. They got a relaunch party going on Facebook Live. I'll post the link to that in both on my Facebook page, on the show's Facebook page, and on the show notes page. And again, this Friday, I think it's 7:30 Central Time. Facebook Live. They'll have trivia, live music, and a brand new, amazing PalomaVerdeStore.com website. So you could go and get your CBD from a great looking place where the quality of the website is now going to match the quality of the products. PalomaVerdeStore.com, promo code PEACE when you check out. That gets you a discount and helps the show. All right, let's get into the news today. First story I have is this viral video of police officers stealing bikes from kids. Now, this story hasn't gotten as much national attention because fortunately it didn't end in really any kind of violent interaction. But at the same time, I think Hannah Kotz, who wrote this article at Feed, nails it in her title that this viral video of cops harassing kids riding bikes without a license reveals the root of America's policing problem. So I'm sure a lot of you have seen the video. I don't have this one loaded up. There's not a ton to see because it's mostly just a conversation, but it's somewhat audible because of how far everybody is standing apart. There's some people wearing masks. But what happened is Perth Amboy, New Jersey, apparently has a crime for riding bikes without a license, and I can't imagine this could possibly be a crime. I mean, the license to ride a bike is your parents take the training wheels off. That's pretty much it. But they've somehow codified that into law to further extract money from people. And in this case, they took the bike from these teenagers, and then the teenagers had to walk back down to the station to get their bicycles back from the police officers. Now, one of the boys was handcuffed, although I don't believe he was arrested. So he, like the rest of them, had to walk back down the station to get their bikes. There's an interesting point where the cop is in the video saying, "You think I want to be here taking your bites away? Like, this is so insane, asinine. Like, we have so much better stuff to be doing with our time." But she's saying to the kids, "What is wrong with you? Why won't you follow the stupid laws that I have to enforce?" Rather than looking in the mirror saying, "What the hell is wrong with me? I'm stealing bites from children to enforce a law I don't even believe in." But of course, the kids get their bites taken. There's several ways that this represents, the root of the policing problem. The first is that I'm sure this law isn't universally enforced, and I'm sure it's not, even if there wasn't maybe a racial intent from people involved, that this was a group of black teenagers that was confronted here. You wonder if maybe a group of white teenagers would have the same problem, even if it wasn't necessarily that, the cops, once somebody reported maybe a suspicious group of people responded to the incident, maybe that doesn't even get reported if it's a group of white teens or something like that. And then, of course, just the idea that cops have to constantly be involved in enforcing the most trivial of grievances and infractions, like riding a bike without a license. And, this it escalates to the point where they take the bike. So now you're like taking somebody's property. So you've really upped the stakes. It's not like they just, gave these kids like some tickets and told them to go home. Um, Also probably makes the kids not feel very welcome in this town, and it seems like there's probably a racial element to that, right? Like it's a way for the police officers to make sure that the wrong people don't end up in their town, and sometimes those people get profiled as being people of color. So in all these ways, that this is just at the root of America's policing problem, I think it is a great example. And um, yeah, the cop, when she said that, should have looked at herself and said, "Boy, here's your bite back. I'm leaving. I'm gonna go do something worth my time. Invest in an actual violent crime, not the most absurd, of licensing laws." So there's a really interesting contradiction here, where police will enforce the most trivial of laws against the rest of us, and when it's, within their own range, it doesn't seem like there's really much of a concern to enforce the rule of law at all. We have another example of this as DC cops totaled their cars during a drag race, and we learned about this not through any like announcement that arrests had been made or anything like that, but rather a leaked internal email from a DC police commander, and she said that yesterday 60 scout cars were totaled because officers decided, instead of fighting crime, patrolling their beats, or engaging the community, they decided to drag race each other on Anacostia Avenue at 5 p.m. in the evening. Judging by where I kind of looked at where this picture was, I mean, it seems to be somewhere that there could be residential or community activity. It's not like they were doing this on some remote highway stretch where. But I'm not familiar with the area, so maybe I could be mistaken. But it seems like that this probably happened in a residential area. The email, I believe, said they were traveling 60 miles per hour, but I saw a report from another woman saying that there were cars traveling as fast as 90 miles per hour. There were the two officers driving in car, of course, but then there's also two officers in the passenger seat. So in total, you have 4 police officers here whose job it is to enforce the law, take it during their shift to go and drag race and absolutely violate the law, put the community in danger, and then waste at the very least tens of thousands of taxpayers' dollars destroying cars. And of course, right now we're probably paying for them while they're on a paid vacation. Those paid suspensions that they get whenever they do something really wrong. And again, it just goes to show how corrupt the whole system is. That if this was 2 teenagers that were drag racing, totaled their cars, they probably would have made a Facebook post, a Twitter post. They would have posted the officers with these kids in handcuffs, like, hey, look, we're keeping your community safe, when in reality they're the ones making our community so dangerous. The next video I have, an incident I have, is quite disturbing, and this is the arrest of Karen Gardner. She's a 73-year-old woman who has dementia and some other neurological disorders, and apparently walked out of a Walmart with about $14 of goods last June. There was, I guess, some kind of confrontation at the Walmart. It's not completely clear to me what happened. They said she pulled a woman's mask down. But in general, she's obviously a fairly nonviolent person. She's walking down the highway when the police officer approaches, and just kind of doesn't treat the police officer like he's an authority. And, she's just like, I'm doing my own thing, doesn't really pay attention to him. She was picking wildflowers. And so rather than, trying to maybe put his arm around her and say, ma'am, I need you to walk back to my car with me, and gently guide her that direction, he throws her to the ground and, attempts to put her hands behind her back to arrest her. Now, one of the problems with this, of course, is that when you're arresting somebody who's 73 years old, it may not be so easy for them to put their hands behind their back, or it may come with a mere amount of discomfort. And so, to attempt to do this in maybe a gentle way, I mean, they say the woman weighs 80 pounds. If you watch the video and look at her and you are a grown man, you will understand that you did not have to use this much force to get this woman to do what he wanted her to do. Now, once he gets her back to the car, he gets even more violent with her, and it appears that he sadistically shoves her arms up her back until possibly her arm fractures and her shoulder dislocates. It may be just because he's cruel and likes to torture her. I don't know. I'm just speculating there as to why he did it. But you could see once she's on the hood of the car, it appears that he, again, needlessly, torturing this woman. Again, she, 80 pounds, maybe 100 pounds. Look, again, being a grown man, you know that if you could pick up a bag at Costco, that you could handle the the dog food size bag from Costco, that you could handle this woman, and that this police officer just it was unnecessarily cruel. Now, when the video cuts off there's I think about 14 minutes of the arrest footage, and then we'll get into what happened after, which is even more disturbing. But the rest of the arrest footage, there's a female cop that actually comes up. And you would think maybe this is one of those cases where she sees an elderly woman and like at least tries to like de-escalate the situation a little bit. Nope, she just shoves the lady's arms further up her back. And so, this horrendous arrest happens of an elderly woman that we could, all imagine that this is our grandma, right? This woman didn't need to be treated this way. And not only was he more forceful than he needed to be, he applied pain to this woman needlessly, which I'm pretty sure is like the definition of torture. And so then we have this article from the Washington Post when they get into what actually happened after. And the title of the article is, "After violently arresting woman with dementia, police laughed at video. It shows we crushed it." And so, I will say that, police have some uncomfortable parts of their job that they have to do. Like, if this was like a big guy who was, on some PCP or something like that, like it is difficult to do this. And so like, maybe is some dark humor going on, but what happened here isn't that. And this is just showing how cruel that these police officers were. So the woman is actually sitting handcuffed to a bench inside a booking cell as this happens. And this is they release about an hour of video, but the officers are sitting on the computer apparently watching their body camera footage again as this woman is sitting there crying, and they're talking to each other, and the guy's going, "Ready for the pop? Hear the pop," and like laughing as he's actually talking about the pop sound that made when I think it's when he injured her shoulder, probably popped her shoulder and dislocated her shoulder. Now, mind you, they haven't given her medical attention yet. It's 6 hours later that she actually ends up seeing the doctor. But they further joked, saying that this went great, that she was ancient, senile, and flexible. So they understood that she was an elderly woman who was senile, not, able to act in the way, had dementia, right? And that they did this to her anyways, understanding this stuff. One of the officers said, "We crushed it." At one point, I believe they're actually talking about how he's happy that he got to use the restraint that he used on this woman because he hasn't had an opportunity to do otherwise. Now, I've worked with some good people who have been put in situations where they've had to restrain people. I worked in a situation where kids, especially younger kids, would get in situations where they were, because of their mental illness, out of control in a way where they had to be held back or they would hurt themselves or somebody else. And never once after any of these restraints do people they feel bad. Like it's not something you enjoy doing. You understand that this is what you need to do to make sure this kid doesn't hurt anybody in this moment, but it's not something you're ever gleeful about. I went through the restraint trainings and, talked to the guy who did most of the restraints, and, he would talk about doing the restraints, but it wasn't something that was a joyful experience ever, right? And these officers enjoyed what they did, which indicates to me that they like to hurt people. And so I just don't understand how you don't kick all these officers off the force. They've apparently suspended 4. But from the moments of the video I watched, it seems a hell of a lot more officers are aware of the situation. And honestly, all these guys should spend time in prison. The first officer, you could lock him up forever. He tortured an old woman. The second police officer who came should get, several assault charges. She participated in the holds that he was doing on her and her pain and torture. Then the officers who were at the precinct allowed an elderly woman who had a fractured arm and a dislocated shoulder to sit in a cell handcuffed to a bench for 6 hours without providing her with medical care. That's several crimes. And then also for not arresting the officers that were laughing about injuring her also has to be a crime. And so the fact that there's an entire police force out there somewhere pretty close to me in Colorado that is made up of absolutely sociopaths is terrifying. All right, so again, the next police incident. This is Isaiah Brown, and this from NBC News. Isaiah Brown, black man shot by Virginia deputy who gave him a ride home, is in critical condition. And so Isaiah Brown is 32 years old and apparently had his car break down earlier in the day and had a sheriff's deputy give him a ride home. And then later in that officer shift, apparently, there was a 911 call made, and it seems unclear of who made the 911 call or all the details. But in the 911 call, Mr. Brown did threaten his brother and say that he had a gun. But also in that 911 call, those statements were retracted. And so it's unclear of what, information was relayed to the officer. Maybe they just told him he had a gun and said he's going to kill his brother. But anyways, the officer arrives on the scene, and it appears that Mr. Brown is walking down the road with the house wireless phone to his ear. The officer pulls up and is like, "Get the gun away from your head! Get the gun away from your head!" And then they released body cam video, but for the life of me, I really can't tell what's happening in that video. I watched it 5 times. That's why I'm not showing it. And then. So something happens. The officer then shoots Isaiah Brown 10 times. The shots are all rapid fire. That's one of the issues that you have with so many of these police shootings, that once they pull the trigger once, they empty the clip into the person, even if it's not necessary. You don't know that you need to shoot him all these times, but yet the officer kept pulling the trigger anyways. So that, that's another disturbing part of this whole narrative here, is that he ends up being shot 10 times and appears that he didn't have a weapon, and that it doesn't seem that this officer ever considered it a possibility that Mr. Brown may have a phone and not a weapon. Hopefully this officer ends up getting charged and it only remains attempted murder and not murder, since Isaiah Brown may be able to pull through. He's on life support. There's another police shooting that is getting a lot of attention. Right now, the family is saying that they saw 20 seconds of the dash cam or the body cam video, and it shows an execution, and that they have independent a coroner's report that says that he was shot in the back of the head. I'm waiting for more information on this one, just because we only have really information coming out from one side. Although I would think that if the police had any real claim to defense, they would have released some information to the public by now. Talking about some other criminal justice stories going on here. The people involved who were at the Capitol to protest on January 6th continue to face absurd conditions in court. This from The Hill. Capitol rioters' attorney defends mesh mask as inspired by Lana Del Rey. I don't know who Lana Del Rey is. Apparently she's a famous singer who wore a mesh mask. And then you have this woman who was at the Capitol wear a mesh mask inspired by Miss Del Rey. The problem here for the woman who's not in jail but is accused of committing crimes on the sits is that the judge in her case said that if she left her home, she had to wear a mask. For me, this raises all kinds of questions on, is this even constitutional to mandate that somebody wear a mask? Isn't this a medical question? Of course, you could say it's a different situation in the case that you're on any kind of private property, but at least if you're just walking out of your home, you should be able to not have a mask on. Also, this runs into problems with what's the information here of how effective are masks. If you're worried about her spreading the virus, maybe you just mandate that she has to stay home the whole time. And then on the other side of it too, that the CDC even now says that if you're not vaccinated and you go outside for a run, you don't have to wear a mask. So does she have to wear a mask in cases even the CDC says no? Because then this court is going against, quote unquote, the science. And it's just disturbing to me, the restrictions that they're putting on in these cases and how much they're getting away with, because if anybody tries to stand up and say anything, they're like, oh, look who's defending the white supremacist, Capitol rioter, insurrectionist murderers, when that narrative isn't even correct. Another disturbing thing going on, and seems to be in response to the Capitol riot, and that is secret record reveals FBI hunted for domestic terrorists without warrant. And so the FISA court has revealed to the rest of us that the FBI has been sifting through the National Security Agency's massive troves of foreign communications for information on Americans with racially motivated violent extremists. What that actually means, like who's a racially motivated violent extremist versus who's a racist, who's a violent person, how those combine into factors and everything, and what that really means, who they're targeting. Is it white supremacists? Are they targeting jihadists? Because that kind of fits the category. There's certainly different groups of extremists, black supremacist groups. And so who's actually being targeted here seems to be a real question that's worth asking. There's a lot of assumption that they're going after the Trump supporting white nationalists, and that's why this is something that people are supportive of. I wouldn't be so sure that they're not going after a whole lot of other people too. But even then, we have a Fourth Amendment for a reason. It's to prevent unwarranted searches and seizures. And this is certainly an unwarranted search, where they're just sifting through NSA data looking for any old information they could find. And who says when they find information of people committing crimes that have nothing to do with white supremacy, some black guy selling drugs or something like that, that they're not going to use the information that they're finding from this database to track down and commit people that they accuse of committing other kinds of crimes. All right, one last criminal justice story here, and that is a disappointing ruling from the Supreme Court. There was a case in front of them about a juvenile who received a life sentence without parole. And, these are difficult cases. These are kids oftentimes who have killed somebody, again, people under the age of 18 who committed a murder, and they receive a sentence of life sentence without parole. Now, I think the court has taken steps in recent years to start to move towards the idea of, if you're a juvenile, you could get a life sentence, just not a life sentence without parole. That eventually you should have the right to go in front of a board and to appeal your case to be a free person, that you have reformed yourself. And, after 4 or 5 decades, somebody's, 50 or 45, 50, 60 years old after they killed somebody, being 13, 14, 15, should they be able to get out of jail or not? I think they should at least have the cause to appeal their case. This was a decision made on the, quote unquote party lines, with the conservative justices, ruling that juveniles don't have this right, and that this particular juvenile defender didn't have a case. All right, this one from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. This is unbelievable. In the year of the coronavirus, world military spending rose to nearly $2 trillion in 2020. Crazy. Again, everybody is being asked to make all these sacrifices because of COVID. Apparently, except the militaries of the world, which is, you would think you had this global threat that you need to come together to fight, and that could be the narrative. There are talks about the UN and having global ceasefires for the COVID pandemic at the beginning. And it makes me think that some of the rulers of a lot of these countries, including the world's biggest military spender, the US, by the way, 39% of that $2 trillion coming from the US. Why the hell is 39%, 40% of the total military spending from the world coming from one country? And they have such crappy military equipment that they're constantly warning that we can't, maintain the military commitments that we have because the equipment's not good enough and we need more of it. I think they actually end up undercounting U.S. defense spending a little bit by that number, but maybe everybody's undercounted some. But it's just another point to go to. What the hell, They again ask us to give up so much, and they won't even cut military spending a little bit during the pandemic. All right, so a couple stories on immigration here, and I just want to highlight that the immigration outrage has completely gone away, but the suffering of the people who are trying to migrate to the U.S. and then the unjust immigration system that they face once they get to the U.S. actually hasn't changed. And so this is from Al Jazeera. U.S. on track to accept fewest refugees in history. And by the dates that they go by for this article. So they're saying for the fiscal year 2021, which is how this is tracked, the U.S. has a cap of 15,000 refugees they could let in. But so far, they've only let in about 2,000. Now, half of this time is under the Trump administration, so he gets a lot of the blame for this. True, half of it is under the Biden administration. Also, I guess you would expect maybe some refugee numbers to be down in 2020 and 2021, only because COVID may slow down some of these processes. There's less personnel in some embassies or something like that, but still, for it to be on track to be a record low at 4,000 this year is quite concerning, and it should be a big red flag. Now, as a candidate, Biden was very confrontational and accused Trump a few times. I think of having at least, xenophobic, if not outright racist ideas behind his, refugee policy and restricting the number of refugees to such a low number. But as president, Biden hasn't changed that. And in fact, the initial report from the Biden administration, we got this last week, was that they were going to keep Trump's cap on the number of refugees set at 15,000. Now, after a bunch of outrage, they said that they're going to up the cap, but didn't specify the number. But again, even if you raise the cap, you say we could let in 1 million refugees in the next year. If you only actually let in 4,000 refugees, it doesn't matter what the cap number is. And so it's so obvious, and it's such a obvious, look into the matrix when you can see that at this point in the Trump administration, everybody was absolutely livid over these kind of decisions. And now it's the same thing is happening, and nobody is sounding an absolute peep. Now, there's other things going on, like the U.S. is looking at creating an AntiGraft task force for Central America. This would include members of the Treasury and Justice Department. And the idea is that the U.S. aid to Central America doesn't work because corrupt figures in those countries make off with the aid, or they, use that money to gain even more influence in that country and make the problem even worse. And so the way that they're going to combat this is with, what's the foreign policy favorite tool? Sanctions, sanctions, sanctions. That's right. They are going to sanction people from the Northern Triangle if they are, believed to be corrupt. Now, this task force has apparently just been proposed, but then a couple days after that announcement, we got U.S. sanctions against 2 Guatemalan officials over alleged corruption. So even if the task force maybe doesn't get a formal and permanent designation, it seems like the U.S. is going to go that route coming to Latin America. Now, it seems Kamala Harris is very much in charge of this policy right now, so a good look into what her presidency might look like. And we have the U.S. announcing $310 million in aid to Central America. Her idea is that we don't want these people in the U.S., and so we got to figure out a way to keep them in their home countries. They do this a couple of ways. The first is by putting pressure on a lot of these governments Guatemala, Mexico, Honduras, Nicaragua, to not allow to beef up their border security. So if people could not cross Mexico's southern border, then they won't cross America's southern border. And another thing they're doing is they're trying to put some money into these countries. They say that this money is going to go to development, although I think it'll likely lead to more corruption, despite their attempt to sanction the corrupt people and just end up making the matter in a lot of these countries worse. One thing I noticed, a narrative that's forming, is they're really trying to focus on that this is a result of climate change, that this is why people are leaving, that these are climate refugees, and they in no way want to look at how the historical U.S. foreign policy in Latin and Central America has led to so much chaos and destruction, and so the worst of the people coming to power. There's been genocides carried out in Guatemala, and all kinds of nefarious death squads that the U.S. has supported in these countries. And they don't want to talk about and look at, those kind of U.S. policies that have created this situation. They want to just say, oh, climate change, so we're going to give you some money to fix the problems, when I think the money is only going to lead to the exacerbation of the problems. And also, if you really want to start to help, maybe ending the drug war will be a way to go, and to take a lot of the funding away from the most corrupt people in these countries. Possibly some good news on Korea, although I don't expect it to materialize that way. But this from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. A report from the Korean foreign minister says the U.S. is reviewing a peace declaration that would officially end the Korean War. Now, he says that this is a serious review, but acknowledges that there would have to be progress made towards denuclearization before signing. So this isn't something that the U.S. and South Korea are just going to go ahead and do. It would be a part of a deal or agreement with North Korea. One of the things to consider would be that even without a big agreement with North Korea, officially ending the Korean War doesn't do anything. It doesn't change the situation on the Korean Peninsula. It's just symbolic. But maybe taking that just symbolic act and then taking a couple of other actions to de-escalate the situation in Korea, canceling the annual war games that the U.S. carries out with the South Korean military, withdrawing even a portion of the U.S. troops in South Korea, could, be a signal to the Korean government that, hey, like, the Americans are serious about talking. Let's try to move towards the, direction of a less tense and hostile situation. It doesn't have to be that the North Koreans give up all their nuclear weapons right away. Steps could be made in a positive direction, but it seems the Biden administration is committed to what's been the U.S. policy for several years, and that is North Korea must denuclearize, and then we'll look at lifting sanctions and normalizing relations, ending the Korean War. Biden has announced that he'll make his first international trip to NATO headquarters. This looks like some bad news, just because I'm sure he's going to go there and say things about how we need to combat Russia and China, and possibly indicate, that the U.S. and NATO are supportive of Ukraine, which, if you've been listening to the show recently, there's a tense and hostile situation there, because Biden has given more and more security promises to the Ukrainians, and led to a situation where there's a massive military buildup on the Ukrainian-Russian border. And a little bit of good news, though, is it appears Biden will hold a summit with Putin this summer. They say that the talks around this are developing quick. And so, this would be an even better first international trip to go see the U.S.'s, by the hot standard, biggest opponent, and, sit down and talk and work towards peace. Interesting story here is the U.S. A U.S. warship will be joining the new HMS that's the British Navy, Queen Elizabeth, their new aircraft carrier, in missions to India, Singapore, Japan, and South Korea. And so this, I think, goes to show about the increasing UK naval activity in this region, the South China Sea, the Indo-Pacific, and then also the U.S. now being more involved in the UK exercises by putting one of our warships in those, even though we're sailing warships around the South China Sea all the time anyways. In Afghanistan, the U.S. is deploying an additional 650 additional troops to help with the withdrawal. Doesn't make any sense, as always, that we end up adding more troops to these countries when we say we're getting out. Again, this is coming with more firepower. Some of this is transport planes, but some of it's air support, like AC-130 gunships. So if it was a bunch of transport planes, then that kind of made sense. You gotta bring the planes to Afghanistan to load them up to take them out. But they fudge with those numbers all the time about how many troops are in Afghanistan. The real key here is they're deploying more gunships and more air support to Afghanistan because they're going to fight more war in that country. And this isn't about ending the war. It could be a situation in Syria. I said this at the time when Trump announced his withdrawal there. And then they said, oh, we got to deploy some extra forces to help with the withdrawal. And then they never withdrew. Some news on Israel, and this is important stuff here. There's been some pretty serious clashes going on in Jerusalem, and police activity arresting dozens of people every night, dozens of people being injured, and it's, I think, mainly because a lot of the Palestinian holy and cultural sites in Jerusalem have been closed off by the Israelis. And then so the Palestinians have been going to protest that. And there have been groups of ultra-right Israeli nationalists chanting death to Arabs at those rallies. And so this is a pretty disturbing situation. Again, it's escalated pretty seriously. I mean, even in the U.S. in the past couple of years when we've had protesters and counter protesters, they don't chant death to each other at each other. And that's what's been going on here. Now, Israel finally did decide to lift and allow Palestinians to gather at Jerusalem's Damascus Gate. And I guess that's a pretty big deal for the Palestinians. I don't understand all their Ramadan and all the cultural stuff that goes along with it. I do know that if the Christians couldn't go to their churches in the U.S. on Easter or Christmas, that there would be hell to pay for the people not letting them go, and that's something important to remember. Maybe the biggest news on Israel, though, is, and this from the AP, global rights group accuses Israel of apartheid and persecution. That's right, Human Rights Watch, one of the world's biggest human rights groups and international rights groups, had said that Israel is guilty of crimes of apartheid and persecution because of discriminatory policies towards Palestinians. This is big. I've only looked through their actual report a little bit. It's 200 and some pages, but of course, Israel says that it's not true. But more and more international groups starting to come out and say that Israel is an apartheid state is going to make it a lot harder for everybody who, tries to change and engage in whataboutism when it comes to that label being appropriately applied to Israel by saying anti-Semitism. Is Human Rights Watch anti-Semitic? Really? We know that's not the case. And so I think that this designation is actually pretty powerful. Speaking about police killings, we had one here in Israel pretty recently where, of course, the Israeli soldiers say it was a ramming incident, but by all accounts, and again, this is just reported from the AP, what actually happened is the Palestinian man pulled up to the checkpoint, stopped his car, and then the police opened fire and killed him while he was sitting next to his wife. Just a straight up execution. And that these are the kinds of things that happen in Israel all the time, and this is why the apartheid label ends up being applied and is appropriate. I have this interesting story that's gained a lot of attention in the hot circles about Iran's foreign minister, Javad Zarif, complaining about the IRGC influence on Iran's foreign policy, and also him being told by John Kerry that Israel was carrying out military actions against Iran in Syria. So A couple things on this story. The first is there's no real news here. I guess Zarif complaining about the IRGC does give a somewhat interesting look inside of Iran to see that there are different political factions there, that the IRGC is far more hardlined than some of the moderates in the government. And this is one of the reasons that we should have stayed in the Iran nuclear deal, because it would have empowered the moderates in Iran rather than empowering the Hots. But they of course made the opposite decision, and by withdrawing from the agreement ended up empowering the Hots. But I think a story that's getting a lot more attention, of course, because John Kerry is now back in Biden's administration. Zarif said something about being informed by John Kerry that Israel has carried out more than 200 attacks against Iranian forces in Syria. Now, there is some, I guess, dispute from the Iranian government about this, because they say this was a 7-hour long talk or speech or event that Zarif was at, and that only about 3 hours of the actual footage or transcripts have been leaked. And so there's a lot in that, he may have really qualified his statements a lot more than people are pretending. Could have been very selectively edited, but they didn't come out right out and deny what Zarif said. So it makes me think that, like, in some sense, it's probably true. The problem is that it's really not news. Everybody knew that that Israel was bombing Syria throughout the Syrian civil war, that they were backing the Al Qaeda opposition to Assad. And I actually found this article here from Haaretz from April 11th of 2016, where Netanyahu himself admitted for the first time that Israel was bombing Syria in Israel was bombing Iran and Syria. And so, Scott Horton also like, hey man, this was on my show the whole time. This was at antiwar.com the whole time. Everybody should absolutely know that, these actions are taking place. Now, maybe official, in like an official sense, that, John Kerry was the first U.S. official to recognize this as a reef. Maybe something like that happened, or maybe giving the number figure was something that Kerry first gave, but people knew that Israel was carrying out a heavy bombing campaign against Iran in Syria that whole time. Another interesting story that we had today, that Iranian ships swarmed U.S. guard vessels in the Persian Gulf, Navy says. I mean, there's, again, so much loaded up here. And fortunately, the Wall Street Journal did actually include that this happened in the Persian Gulf in their headlines, when so many other outlets I noticed just says Iranian ships are harassing U.S. Coast Guard vessels. And it's like, that sounds interesting, because that probably happened in the Gulf of Mexico. Nope, this happened in the Persian Gulf, which, of course, the U.S. treats like our own lake, that we get to dictate whatever's going on there. So we really shouldn't be surprised that the U.S. Coast Guard vessels are there, just like they would be in, like, one of the Great Lakes or something like that. Really disturbing that it's happening, and no surprise that the Iranians are swarming the U.S. Coast Guard ships, because that's not the American coast. It's the Iranian coast. Last thing I have on today's show is just there seems to be an increasingly violent situation going on in Somalia. I'm not aware of all the details, but it appears that the president, Mohammed Abdullahi Mohammed, had his term in office extended by the parliament. I believe a couple weeks ago on the show I mentioned how there was the police chief of Mogadishu tried to overrule this and was deposed and relieved of his duty because of it. And now there's other rioting and fighting and shooting breaking out in Somalia and in the capital of Mogadishu, as people are unhappy with the president extending his rule in this fashion. So I guess I had spent probably more of that to develop in the coming weeks, unfortunately. And one of the narratives that I'm guessing is going to take form will be that this is because Donald Trump pulled U.S. troops out of Somalia. At this point, I see no evidence of that at all, and that this seems like a problem with the government and the system that the U.S. has tried to thrust upon Somalia, rather than just letting them keep their Islamic courts union. We broke that up. We try to impose, the government that we want in Somalia on Somalia, and it's just not going to hold up. It's going to fall apart, and it's going to lead to fighting, death, and violence. And hopefully, the Somalis will be able to one day, kind of figure out their country without outside foreign interference. All right, everybody, thanks for listening to the show today. That's where I'm going to wrap. I'll be back on Friday with a new show. Again on Friday, 7:30 Texas Central Time. That'll be 6:30 Mountain Time. Paloma Verde's launching their new website, so check out music trivia at the Paloma Verde Facebook page. Again, I'll post the links to that Facebook event. Share the show. You can find it on video versions at YouTube, Odysee. It's also posted at the Libertarian Institute. Audio's up anywhere you can listen to it. Social media, MeWe, Facebook, and Twitter. And then donate to the show, Patreon, Subscribestar, Bitcoin Cash wallet addresses are in the show notes page. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Again, I'll be back with another show on Friday.